I'm going to build on really what particularly Sophie's been talking or introduced us to, the idea of mapping. I work primarily in India, but recently ran a project here in Hackney, in East London, where I live, working with young people. And that was called the Creating Hackney as Home project, and that involved a process of community asset mapping, although in this instance, while community asset mapping would normally involve different stakeholders, this was primarily working with young people, and I'll come to why that was particularly important. So I'll briefly outline the project, and then we'll hopefully show one of the films that were made, and then we'll have a little bit of interaction. And then again, as Sophie's done, I'll come to how we're going to be using some of these processes and how we want to rethink using community asset mapping within the context of small cities in India. So in 2013, I was working with a group of young people and a community partner in Hackney in East London in the lead up, well, this actually prior to that, it was in the lead up to the Olympic Games. And just talking to young people, what were their key issues, their key concerns, their key anxieties. It really centred actually not on the issues that I thought it would, which was issues of racism, issues of cultural diversity. We just had the riots in Hackney and other parts of London and the UK at that time. But it was on urban regeneration. It's just become part of our daily discourse in these areas that are undergoing rapid urban change. In fact, areas like Hackney, which it links, is right next to the Olympic area as one of the Olympic host boroughs. It's undergone rapid change. And it's, we'll go Monet's film, yeah. So these conversations led me to thinking about this idea of home. How do we think about home in these processes of intense urban change, rapid urban change in a city like London? If we think about Alison Blunt's, amongst others, work on home, that home is something that's always in becoming, it's a process, something that we are creating through our everyday activities, our everyday practices, our everyday relationships, but place that within the context of rapid demolition, which is what we've seen in Hackney, with whole housing estates being demolished and rebuilt. It's a process that we're seeing across London. How then do we rethink home? How can we situate our understanding of home as a place in becoming and the power relations inherent in that within the context of constant demolition and rebuild? So much of the research on urban regeneration and gentrification highlights these agonistic, if not antagonistic, relationships between existing residents and newcomers, particularly in the case of gentrification. But most of this research has been from an adult perspective. So if we take the background to Hackney, it's one of the poorest boroughs, actually, in England. Its demographics are shifting, though, so it is actually improving on the human development indicators, the social indicators. But the way that demographics are shifting is that we're seeing increasing numbers of middle class, higher socioeconomic residents moving into the area, and in particular young creative professionals moving in. So it ties in with this idea of futuring. While we're focusing on India, you see this idea of futuring and this focus on digital economies and smart cities here in London as well. If you go over, if you have a chance, if you haven't been for a while, to see the Stratford, the redevelopments around Stratford, the International Quarter, it's really interesting. This word future comes up again and again and again. The future of work is here. That's one of the hoardings. The future, yeah, the way that time is played with is actually really interesting. Future is here. The future of work is here. So we're seeing increasing contesting of space in these areas as different stakeholders vie for space, contest for space. We're seeing young people feeling increasingly excluded from spaces, particularly the young people that we were working with on this project. We see a class, the creative class, that has the capacity to shape the city into its own likeness. Again, creating the sense of exclusion, affective exclusion in particular, which I'll come to in a moment. And so we see the value of assets shifting in the city. What's given priority? What assets are given priority? What assets are demolished? What assets are ignored? What assets are made invisible? So these were sort of the questions that were informing my early development of the project. So the key aim of creating Hackney as Home was to think about youth perspectives. What is their experience of gentrification? As I say, most of the work that's done on urban redevelopment is done through adult eyes. So we wanted to really see what young people felt and experienced in the city. Now, as you'll see, hopefully, no? Yeah, if we can get the online, that's fine. Go to www.hackneyashome. Hopefully, it should be there. We wanted to work with visuals because, again, the way that young people are represented is usually in negative stereotypes. Working with young people from the estates in East London, mostly from African Caribbean and African Caribbean backgrounds. There's Monet's there, Matthew Monet's. So we wanted to give young people a chance to use visuals to recreate these representations, and we also thought it would be an interesting way to, more interesting for participants, and something we could talk about. Maybe Sophie's experience of working with the phone and the app, but especially getting young people engaged in research, especially young men engaged in research, is something I found difficult in the past. So using visuals, using different forms of creative methodologies, and we were actually able to have 4 young men and 2 young women work on the project with us. So coming to the project itself, we wanted it to be participatory. So this is, again, where the idea of community asset mapping comes into play. Iona's already mentioned that community asset mapping is both looking at the tangible and intangible assets that are valued by different stakeholders within a community. And Sophia will talk more about this afternoon in the workshop as well. It's a process that's being increasingly used in urban regeneration projects. Now, there's some questions around that, whether local governments are just using it as a compliance tick box exercise, or whether they are actually genuinely taking on board the different experiences of the community and the way that they are able to identify the different assets. For the Creating Hackney Home project itself, we hired 5, initially 6 and 1 dropped out, but 5 peer research assistants. They were in charge of the research. Oh, great. I was going to say, how am I going to fill that 5 minutes going through my head? Struggling already. We'll find out in a minute. This will be one of the films, so this is Monet's film. So we employed 5 peer research assistants for the whole project. Monet was one, who you'll see in a moment. They were all 16 to 18 years old. They all lived in estates, in different estates, social housing estates in East London. They were responsible for the research. We went through a process of training, again, like emphasising Sophie's point that the importance of training, putting in time for training in this process, I think, is critical. It's a very time-intensive process, I think. And so they became our ethnographers. They became our research assistants. In 2.5 days, we gave them a very basic introduction to Geography 101, to visual methodologies. They did the research for their films. They collected other material for us, both tangible material like documentation, but also interviews with other people, their families, their friends. So again, this idea of working with one small group that then has a ripple effect throughout their communities, throughout their neighbourhoods as well. We also gave them flip cams in which they could record their critical reflections on the process. So learning, again, was a very important process of this. How they were learning as they went through. We would have regular meetings on a one-on-one basis, but also as a research team. So they were able to reflect on what they were learning, reflect on themes that were coming up within the research, whether it was questions of identity, questions of power. There was constant support from the research team, so we were always lurking in the background. And again, we can discuss what that means in terms of participatory ethos. But as I say, the regular meetings were there for support. We used Grassini's idea of skilled vision. We wanted them to think about the familiar with new eyes and to think about it with the skilled vision of a geographer as they went about making their films. And we literally started them off with a mapping process to map Hackney. And that was really interesting in terms of how on a bit of flip chart paper they drew what they imagined to be Hackney, and how they defined home really centred around the familiarity of buildings, which again is interesting when those buildings are being demolished. When if you walk through East London, and even I continue to do ethnographic work there, there's a constant churn of retail outlets, coffee shops, things demolishing, getting retaken, etc., etc. So memory and place is being disjointed actually in places like Hackney. So this idea that familiarity, the sense of home being centred on buildings, becomes very complicated in a place like Hackney. That's changing. People, being able to walk down the street, being able to see familiar people, friends, family, that's also being disjointed because people are having to move out, their friends are having to move out, families are having to move out because of the demolition of homes. And importantly, the affective sense, or the emotional sense, the emotional content of home. And that's the hardest one to talk to planners and architects and designers about. Probably becoming more common, I think, in the dialogue, but certainly when we were talking to council, this idea that understanding how people feel about a space, understanding that sense of comfort that you have in particular spaces and what happens when that's dislocated, when you no longer feel you belong. And it's not necessarily there are keep out, no ball game signs, which we do see around the estates, for example. It's really just the critical mass of a particular new demographic, the young, creative, urban, predominantly white professional moving into different areas, pockets of areas in Hackney that are excluding some of these young people. So mapping was a really brilliant exercise for these young people to sort of work out how they defined home, but also where they felt at home in this changing space. 5 minutes. Oh, crikey. Okay. So let me show you the film, because it is only 5 minutes. And this is Monet. So Monet's expression of her experience of gentrification.
Emotional, memories, restrictions, benefits, young, old, destroyed, rebuilt, dreams, strangers, friends, when, how, say it, you believe it, the same thing, differences, becoming, family, safety, trust, inspiration, dedication, limitations, free, belief, race, age, opinions, space, fun, board, life, death, Hackney, home. Swinging freely, kids laughing, nothing sweeter than that. Chilling, joking, chatting rubbish, put on that silly hat. Kids are kids, but not for long. When you're on the top of the tower, you feel so damn strong. Eating sweets till you feel sticky, running around till you feel sickly. But nothing beats having fun. Football, water fights in the sun. Kids are kids, but not for long. This is a poem, not a song. Blocks, alleyways hidden from the light, nighttime dark days keeping out of sight. Losing yourself, finding yourself, trying to be hidden. Find trouble in trouble, that place is forbidden. Chilling in the darkness, people think it's bad, but nobody ever knows about the past that we had. Getting kicked out of play areas and not much place to go. Some became gang members, but each to their own. didn't follow others, I found my own space. My love for performing happened in this place. Home or just a house? Friends or just people I know? You said, he said, we said, rumours, problems, solutions. Always in need, family, loyalty, always in greed. Needing something, wanting nothing. Am I confused? Are you confused? Alone, alone, alone. No matter what anyone says, Hackney is home.
So just quickly, thank you. Well, thank Monet. So maybe just quickly in the last minute or so, in terms of the assets that are being mapped there by Monet, what comes to mind? Tangible and intangible. What's of value to her? Come on, students. The adventure playground, obviously, yeah. So when you hit 16, you're not allowed in the adventure playground, so you have to find another space. So it's this tensions between age as well. So it's thinking the complications of space use in Hackney, not just about gentrifiers moving in, but there's other divisions there as well around age. So for her, the adventure playground was great, but what do you do when you're a 16-year-old and you're not allowed in the adventure playground anymore? So then there's the built environment, and she talks about the void spaces in the blocks, the tower blocks, so the car parks, the roof terrace where you're not strictly supposed to go, but the kids can hang out there. Other assets. Say again? Hoxton Hall, yeah, exactly. So that's where she ended up. There's a performing arts, a youth performing arts there, so she was working there. So the built environment, different assets, different buildings, different institutions as well. Intangibles? Say again? The idea of Hackney, yeah, their idea of Hackney. And again, we followed all these up with interviews, long discussions with all of them, including their interviews as well with others. So it's this identifying as Hackney. So some of the kids would say that, well, I'm Ghanaian and I'm from Hackney. You know, that's how they identify themselves. So this whole idea of national identity is being completely stepped over, if you like. The sense of comfort, the buildings, loving the grime. This is really interesting. The fact that the new buildings, the council wants nice, shiny new buildings, but the kids actually love the grime. They've built new youth centres for the kids. A lot of the older kids don't like the new youth centres. It's changed over time, obviously, but especially initially, didn't like because they were too shiny, basically. And also the affective sense of home. She has shots there of her home, inside her home, the view, that's really important as well, what she can see from that view, these questions of familiarity. So just some ideas. Yep. And so I was just, before Iona really winds me up, what we're thinking about using the same process, not visuals like in terms of filmmaking. We'll use Sophie's app instead to collect data. This was our data collection for the Hackney project. But for us, there's certainly questions around how do we translate this kind of process into an Indian context, particularly thinking around power relationships, thinking about do we, in a traditional community asset mapping process, you'd get different stakeholders together in a room to do these mapping exercises, to think about outputs like this. How do we do that within an Indian context is something that we'd like to sort of think through today as well as explore in the future as well. So I'll leave it there.